One of the hardest things in life is accepting that not everyone you're meant to love is meant to stay. Unfortunately, some people respond to that pain by doing truly horrifying things. From an ex-boyfriend who faked an emergency to get one last meeting, to another who used the promise of closure to lead his ex to the edge of a cliff. Hey, I'm Nathan, and this is Fatal Files. It was October 17, 2017. Just after sunset, the roads outside Brookings, South Dakota, were already quiet. Harvested fields stretched for miles, and traffic on the rural gravel roads quickly disappeared after dark. Kendra Farley was 29 years old and had recently ended a relationship with her boyfriend, Kyle Foster, 29. It hadn't been one dramatic argument that ended things. It was months of smaller incidents that kept getting worse. Kyle had become controlling, unpredictable, and increasingly angry whenever Kendra spent time with family or friends instead of him. By early autumn, she'd decided she couldn't keep living like that. Since the breakup, she'd stopped answering most of his calls. Still, there was one thing that bothered her. Whenever Kyle became upset, he had a habit of driving for hours on back roads, sometimes sending messages about how he didn't care what happened to him. Friends had warned Kendra not to let those messages pull her back in, but ignoring them was easier said than done. For a lot of people, breaking up is supposed to be the point where things finally start getting better. In Kendra's case, it was the beginning of something much worse. That evening, several texts came from Kyle's phone. He claimed he'd driven off a gravel road outside Brookings and hit his head. A location pin followed, along with a photo showing his pickup sitting partly in a ditch with the driver's door open. Unsure whether he was actually hurt, Kendra grabbed her keys and drove to the location. The relationship may have been over, but her concern for his safety hadn't disappeared overnight. Nearly half an hour later, she found the truck exactly where the photo had shown it. The front tires had slipped into a shallow ditch, but there was no obvious damage. The engine was off, the driver's door was still open, and Kyle was nowhere in sight. Kendra parked behind the truck and searched the immediate area with her phone's flashlight. Fresh footprints led away from the road toward a nearby tree line before disappearing into the darkness. She tried calling Kyle, but the call disconnected almost immediately. Convinced she'd done all she could, Kendra headed back toward her car. Before she reached it, Kyle stepped out from the trees along the roadside. He apologized for the messages and admitted there had never been any accident. He said he only wanted one last chance to talk because he knew she wouldn't agree to meet him otherwise. Kendra told him there was nothing left to discuss and refused when he asked her to get into his truck so they could drive somewhere quieter. The apology quickly gave way to anger. Kyle blamed her family for turning her against him and accused her of throwing away their relationship. Without another word, he climbed back into his truck. Kendra continued toward her car, expecting him to leave. Instead, he started the engine, backed the truck up several yards, and drove straight at her. She tried to get off the road, but the first impact threw her onto the gravel shoulder. Kyle reversed, accelerated again, and struck her repeatedly before finally driving away, leaving both vehicles on the deserted road. It was nearly an hour later when another driver noticed Kendra's car sitting with its headlights still on. After stopping to check if someone needed help, they found her beside the road and immediately called emergency services. Responders arrived within minutes, but Kendra had already died. The medical examiner determined she died from multiple blunt force injuries caused by repeated vehicle impacts. Investigators recovered Kyle's phone, the messages sent to Kendra, and location data from both devices. Tire marks at the scene matched Kyle's truck, while surveillance footage from a nearby gas station captured the truck heading toward the rural road earlier that evening. Kyle fled the area, but was located several days later after investigators traced his cell phone and interviewed people he had contacted following the incident. He was arrested without further incident, later convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to life in prison. What makes Kendra's case so unsettling isn't just how it ended. It's that her compassion, even after everything she'd been through, became the very thing that was used against her. Over in Fort Collins, Colorado, a therapist agreed to meet with a new client who claimed he was struggling after a painful breakup. By the end of the session, the only person fighting to survive would be the therapist herself. It was May 12, 2016. By early evening, most of the offices in a quiet business complex in Fort Collins, Colorado, had already closed for the day. Only a handful of lights remained on, including one where Diane Sheffield was finishing her final appointment before heading home. Diane was 46 years old and had spent more than 15 years working as a therapist. She had helped people through divorce, addiction, grief, anxiety, and abusive relationships. If someone reached out asking for help, Diane believed they deserved to be heard, no matter how difficult their situation seemed. Earlier that afternoon, a man called asking whether she had an appointment available that evening. Using a false name, he claimed he was struggling after a painful breakup and needed someone to talk to. Diane fit him into her schedule, expecting the session to be no different from countless others she'd conducted over the years. When he arrived, nothing about him immediately raised any concerns. He completed the intake paperwork, thanked Diane for seeing him on short notice, and quietly took a seat across from her. For nearly an hour, Diane believed she was speaking with a man who simply needed help. He talked about the breakup, while Diane listened and encouraged him to look beyond what had happened. I can't help thinking about how Diane spent nearly an hour believing she was helping someone through one of the lowest points in his life. Near the end of the appointment, the conversation suddenly shifted. The man began mentioning details about his former relationship that Diane recognized from months earlier. It didn't take long for him to admit he had lied about his identity from the moment he scheduled the appointment. His real name was Devin Pierce, 34. Several months before, Diane had counseled Devin's former girlfriend after the relationship became increasingly abusive. During those sessions, she had encouraged the woman to prioritize her own safety and end the relationship. Devin had spent months convincing himself that Diane, not his own behavior, was responsible for the breakup. Imagine believing the therapist was responsible for your breakup instead of the way you treated your partner. Some guys really can't accept that they're the red flag. By the time Diane realized why he was really there, she was alone in the office with someone who had never intended to receive counseling. She attempted to end the appointment and move toward the exit, but Devin blocked the doorway before she could leave. Diane tried to keep the situation calm while looking for an opportunity to reach the phone, but he knocked it from her hands before she could call for help. As she tried to get around him, he grabbed her by the arms and shoved her back into the office. The struggle moved from one side of the room to the other. A chair tipped over, paperwork scattered across the floor, and a small table slammed into the wall as Diane fought to get away. She managed to reach the door more than once, but each time Devin pulled her back before she could escape. He forced her to the floor, pinned her down, and wrapped both hands around her neck. Diane continued struggling until she gradually stopped moving, and only then did Devin leave the office. The following appointment arrived to find the waiting area empty. After repeated knocks went unanswered, the office was eventually opened, revealing furniture overturned, paperwork covering much of the floor, and Diane lying inside. The medical examiner determined Diane died from manual strangulation. The examination also documented evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. Investigators recovered the false intake paperwork, surveillance footage, and electronic records showing Devin had planned the appointment under a false name. Devin was arrested 2 days later at a motel outside Fort Collins. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life with additional consecutive sentences for the related offenses. It's sad to think Diane lost her life simply because someone couldn't accept responsibility for his own actions. An innocent woman paid the ultimate price for mistakes that were never hers to begin with. The next story happened in Overland Park, Kansas, where an unstable ex went looking for his former girlfriend. When he couldn't find her, someone else paid the price. It was February 3, 2018. The streets in Overland Park, Kansas were quiet that Saturday evening. Most families had already settled in for the night, and the neighborhood had gone almost completely still. Cynthia Talley was 61 years old and had recently welcomed her oldest daughter back home after the end of a difficult relationship. The breakup hadn't happened because of violence. For years, her daughter had tried to help her boyfriend, Joel Warren, 28, overcome his drug addiction and get his life back on track. Every promise to change was followed by another relapse, and eventually she realized she couldn't save someone who refused to help himself. At some point, no matter how much you care about someone, you have to ask yourself whether you're helping them or just delaying the inevitable. Cynthia had watched the relationship slowly wear her daughter down. After the breakup, she hoped life was finally beginning to return to normal. That evening, Cynthia's younger daughter was upstairs finishing homework, while her older daughter was out with friends. Just after dark, someone knocked on the front door. It was Joel. He looked exhausted, spoke rapidly, and struggled to stay focused on the conversation. Cynthia immediately suspected he was under the influence of drugs. Joel insisted her daughter was inside the house and demanded to see her. Cynthia calmly told him she wasn't home and asked him to leave. Instead, Joel became increasingly very agitated, accusing Cynthia of hiding her daughter from him and refusing to believe anything she said. This is one of the cruelest parts of addiction. It can convince someone that the people trying hardest to help them are actually the enemy. Joel no longer believed Cynthia was trying to protect her daughter. He believed she was deliberately keeping them apart. When Cynthia refused to let him inside, Joel forced his way through the front door. The noise sent Cynthia's younger daughter running into a bedroom upstairs, where she locked the door and called emergency services. Meanwhile, Cynthia stayed between Joel and the staircase, repeatedly telling him to leave and refusing to let him search the house. Joel shoved her aside several times, but she kept getting back up, determined not to let him reach the second floor. As Joel tried to force his way farther into the house, Cynthia grabbed hold of his jacket and pulled him back toward the front hallway. The two struggled through the narrow entrance, bumping into a table that overturned and sent framed family photos crashing onto the floor. Even after Joel shoved her into the wall, Cynthia got back up and tried to block his path once again. By then, Joel had completely lost control. He grabbed Cynthia by the arms, dragged her farther down the hallway, and forced her against the wall. As she struggled to break free, he repeatedly slammed her head against the wall before letting her collapse to the floor. He stepped over her and searched several rooms, only to discover his former girlfriend had never been there. Upstairs, Cynthia's younger daughter was still on the phone with emergency dispatcher. By then, the sound of approaching sirens could already be heard outside. Joel ran out the back door only moments before responders arrived. Cynthia died at the scene from severe blunt force head injuries caused by repeated impacts against a hard surface. Bloodstains throughout the hallway, damage inside the home, and the younger daughter's emergency call helped investigators reconstruct the attack. They concluded that Cynthia had continued placing herself between Joel and the rest of the house until she was no longer able to fight. Joel fled on foot through neighboring yards as responders arrived. A short time later, an officer spotted a man matching his description walking along a nearby roadway with bloodstains on his clothing and visible injuries from the struggle. He was taken into custody without further incident. Joel was later convicted of murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. Cynthia's daughter had spent years hoping Joel would change, but in the end, it was Cynthia who lost her life protecting the family she had worked so hard to keep safe. Over in Portland, Oregon, a teacher left work expecting an ordinary trip home, but ended up in a car driven by a man who thought he'd taken the love of his life away from him. And before we continue, if you're enjoying the video, I'd really appreciate you hitting subscribe. It was September 14, 2015. By early evening, the streets of Portland, Oregon were filling with people heading home from work. Taxis lined the downtown blocks, while buses pulled in and out every few minutes, carrying the last wave of commuters across the city. Scott Ramsey was 38 years old and had spent more than a decade teaching science at a local high school. A few months earlier, he had started dating a woman who had recently ended a long-term relationship. Scott knew she'd gone through a difficult breakup, but from everything she'd shared, that chapter of her life was over. Her former boyfriend, Collins Perkins, 39, saw things very differently. After learning she had started seeing someone else, he convinced himself Scott had stolen the woman he loved. He ignored the fact that the relationship had already ended before Scott ever entered the picture. Instead, Collins blamed the new boyfriend for everything that had happened. That's the problem when someone becomes obsessed with finding someone to blame. The truth stops mattering. Over the next several weeks, Collins quietly watched Scott's routine. He learned what time school ended, where Scott usually park, and eventually noticed Scott's car had been taken to a repair shop. That's when he decided to disguise his own sedan with magnetic taxi sign. On the afternoon of September 14th, Scott called for a taxi before leaving work. Collins had been waiting nearby and pulled up moments after the dispatcher confirmed the pickup. The fake taxi displayed the same company markings Scott was expecting, so he climbed into the back seat without suspecting anything was wrong. The ride seemed normal at first, but after several minutes, Scott noticed they had missed the turn toward his neighborhood. Collins calmly blamed heavy traffic and claimed he knew a quicker route. But after the second missed turn, Scott could tell something wasn't adding up. I mean, at this point, it's obvious that something is going on. When Scott reached for his phone to check the route, Collins turned onto a deserted side street and stopped the car, claiming the engine was making an unusual noise. Scott tried both rear door handles while waiting, only to realize they were locked. Before he could react, Collins opened the rear door from the outside and lunged into the back seat. Scott immediately tried to push past Collins, but the cramped back seat left little room to move. The two struggled inside the car as Scott kicked at the doors and grabbed onto the front seats, trying to keep himself from being dragged farther inside. Collins eventually overpowered him, restrained his wrists with plastic zip ties, and drove several more miles to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. Inside, Collins tied Scott to a metal chair and accused him of stealing his former girlfriend. He demanded Scott admit they had been seeing each other before the breakup, but Scott repeatedly insisted they hadn't met until after the relationship had already ended. For nearly an hour, Collins repeated the same accusations while Scott continued denying them. Eventually, Collins untied Scott's ankle, led him outside with his wrists still restrained, and walked him to a gravel service road behind the warehouse. For a brief moment, Scott may have believed he was finally being released. Instead, Collins stepped back and opened fire. He shot Scott more than 20 times before leaving him on the gravel road and driving away. The following morning, a maintenance worker discovered Scott's body near the warehouse and called emergency services. The medical examiner determined Scott died from multiple gunshot wounds. Investigators recovered spent shell casings, plastic restraints, tire impressions, surveillance footage showing Scott entering the fake taxi, and traffic camera footage tracing the vehicle's route to and from the warehouse. After removing the magnetic taxi markings, Collins abandoned the sedan and borrowed a relative's vehicle in an attempt to leave the state. He was stopped the following afternoon and later convicted of first-degree murder, receiving a sentence of 55 years in prison. Scott's girlfriend was left to rebuild her life after losing a man who had become the target of a relationship he'd never been part of. Cases like this remind me that the most dangerous lies aren't always the ones people tell other people. Sometimes they're the ones they tell themselves. Then, for the last story, what was supposed to be one final conversation between two former partners ended with a woman paying the price for simply moving on with her life. It was June 22, 2018. The weather in Charlotte, North Carolina was warm that Friday evening, and a neighborhood park was beginning to empty as daylight faded. A few people were still walking the paved trails. The overlook at the far end of the park had grown quiet. Aubrey Brooks was 28 years old and had ended her relationship with Owen Mitchell, 30, about 4 months earlier. It wasn't an explosive breakup. They had simply realized they wanted different things, and Aubrey eventually decided it was time to move forward. A few weeks later, she began seeing someone new. Owen struggled to do the same. Over the following months, he repeatedly contacted Aubrey, asking if they could meet one last time to exchange a few belongings that had never been returned after the breakup. Aubrey put it off several times before finally agreeing, hoping it would be the last conversation they ever needed to have. I think most people would see that as a reasonable thing to do. They met at the park shortly before sunset. Owen handed Aubrey a small box containing a few photographs, a sweatshirt, and several personal items she'd left behind months earlier. The conversation started off quietly, almost as if they had both finally made peace with the breakup. They talked about work, mutual friends, and how different life had become since the breakup. After returning everything, Owen casually asked whether she had been seeing anyone. Aubrey said she had recently started dating someone and wanted to be honest because she didn't want to give Owen the wrong idea about why she had agreed to meet. Owen's reaction was surprisingly calm. He nodded, said very little, and gave Aubrey no reason to think the conversation had taken a dangerous turn. Instead, he suggested they finish walking to the overlook before heading back to the parking lot. That probably made Aubrey think the conversation had ended better than she'd expected. As they reached the overlook, Aubrey leaned briefly against the waist-high stone barrier while looking across the trees below. Owen stood a few feet away without saying much. When Aubrey turned to leave, Owen asked one final question about the new relationship. She answered that she was happy and hoped he would eventually find someone too. A brief silence settled between them before Owen suddenly stepped forward and shoved Aubrey with both hands. She stumbled backward into the stone barrier, lost her balance, and toppled over the edge. The wooded embankment below dropped more than 40 feet, and Aubrey struck exposed rocks several times before coming to rest near the bottom of the slope. Owen looked over the edge once, turned around, and walked back to the parking lot before driving away. Nearly an hour later, another couple walking the trail noticed Aubrey's phone and purse still sitting beside the overlook. When they looked over the barrier, they saw her lying motionless below and immediately called emergency services. Responders Investigators reached Aubrey a short time later, but she had suffered catastrophic head injuries, multiple fractures, and extensive internal trauma from the fall. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators recovered surveillance footage showing Aubrey and Owen entering the park together and Owen leaving alone less than an hour later. Cell phone location data placed both of them at the overlook, while scuff marks on the stone barrier and damage to Aubrey's clothing matched the physical evidence recovered at the scene. During questioning, Owen claimed Aubrey had accidentally fallen after losing her balance near the overlook and insisted he had panicked before leaving. That account was contradicted by the physical evidence and the timeline reconstructed from surveillance cameras and cell phone records. Owen was later convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 45 years in prison. I've always thought closure is something we give ourselves. Expecting another person to provide it can sometimes leave both people trapped in a chapter that should have ended long before.